Hey everyone, Synthetic Future here from the attic, and today was actually the day that I would release my end of year video. That was until one night before I was going to release that video. I got a message from Peter from Dawesome asking if I was interested in checking out his latest creation. Now my initial thought was, I'm not really in the mood. But then I thought back to the latest post by Dawesome, which was actually about something that did spark my interest by quite a bit, because it has a few things that I find very interesting. The first being a very interesting synth engine, which is always a big plus, because there's only so much you can do with additive, subtractive and that sort of stuff, so something different is always good. But more importantly, it was the price tag of absolutely $0 that really caught my attention, because I like things that make music making more accessible to the world. So something being free is definitely a big boon to the industry, I would say. So I said, yeah, you know what? I will check out your latest creation. So just for you, Peter, I've postponed my last video of the year, I guess. Also, there's of course the unwritten rule that if you're Dutch, you need to accept anything that's free, which is kind of troublesome at times, but it is what it is, I guess. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about ZYKLØP, and I'm going to call it ZYKLØP because there's a Z there, and we're going to pronounce the Z if it's there. So ZYKLØP, what is it? It is basically MIF, but instead of two MIF oscillators, or iris oscillators I think they call them, it has one. And aside from that, it's actually very, very similar. And my first kind of worry with things being free is that there's always a catch. There's always a catch. If something is free, there's a catch. So either you need to fill in a lot of information to get the free thing, which is actually not the case here. You can just go to the website, download it, no account needed, no email registration, no serial numbers, no I don't know what. You can just go there and download it and use it. So that's not the catch. So the other catch is that they really severely neuter the product, so you kind of get a taste, but you still have to buy the actual thing. And I'm glad to say that's also not the case. With ZYKLØP, you actually get a very richly featured synthesizer for free, which is kind of mind-blowing, because that's usually not how businesses work, but I guess here we are. Every once in a blue moon, things just align right, and you get something truly interesting that you can just take. So I've already made a few videos on MIF. Many of the concepts there apply to this as well, but because there are differences, we are going to dive into the DAW and take a little look at what ZYKLØP is and what you can do with it and what you can't do with it, and why you might consider upgrading to MIF if you are interested in getting a little bit more of this goodness. So without further ado, let's get into the DAW and let's take a look at ZYKLØP. Alright, and welcome to the DAW. So here we have ZYKLØP right next to MIF, just to see a little bit of a comparison between the two, and as you can see it's mostly the same interface with some small little changes. So for instance in MIF you get the extra parameter section here, which is gone here. And of course you get more oscillators because you have two irises. You get two effects lanes with different configurations, and you get 6 effects per lane instead of 3. So there are some differences, but overall if you look just at the synth engine part, it is identical, which is very impressive to say the least, because that's really what makes this an interesting bit of software. So let's just toss MIF aside for a bit and let's talk about what we're looking at here. So ZYKLØP is a little bit different than many synthesizers, because even though it does a pretty normal synthesis job of subtractive synthesis. The actual oscillator, the iris oscillator, is actually a system that can take samples and kind of recreate it with an internal engine. Now, this isn't classic sampling, so it's not like you drag your sample in there and it will just use that sample and pitch it around and stuff like that. It will resynthesize it, and it will then allow you to control the internal synth engine through a bunch of macro controls, which are down here. Before we get into that, I think it's just a smart idea to quickly gloss over the rest of the interface, and then we'll get to play around with this for a little bit. So, left side, you have some of your modulators. You can click them and you can edit them. It's very nice and easy. In the middle, you have the iris oscillator. That's where we will be spending a lot of our time in a second. You have some arpeggiator controls. You can add an oscillator to this oscillator, which is a pretty cool concept. A filter section, where you have different filters and modulators to your disposal. An effects section, again, 3 slots for a Zyklop, where you can put some of your effects, and a mod matrix. Now, if you open Zyklop and you don't import any samples, you will by default get this sample. Which is a little bit of a nasty sine wave-like thing. But we can already explore some of the concepts of a Zyklop through that simple sound we have there. So the main concept is not so much about exactly recreating sounds you put into it. It's more about taking sounds and finding new ways to use them. And for that we have these little colored balls, manipulating the sound to be more like a saw, string, brass, square, sync, noise, or sine wave. So once we start to manipulate these parameters, you will see the color change accordingly. And of course you can mix, so you can make purple, which is always the most important color to be able to make. So let's just take this siney sound and let's go through the different modulators. So even without loading any samples, you can already use this as a pretty interesting little cross-fading oscillator thing, which is pretty interesting. Now the row above are a little bit more creative. These are some FM type controls. So let's play around with those for a little bit. So this control allows you to mix between the 4 internal voices. This will become a little bit more interesting once we import a sample. And this allows you to blur between the 4 internal sample engines. Or I should say resynthesis engines. Now for this particular example that doesn't do all that much, but let's move on to the next phase in using ZYKLØP, which is the more interesting phase, and that's actually throwing something in there. So for this I have a op6 right next to me. A nice little bell sound, because when you have an FM synth you need the bell sounds, that's just the laws. So let's quickly record a small section of that, and for this we will use a count-in. So we can make sure it's nice at the start. If you want to do this more professionally, I would definitely recommend recording and trimming the samples and then importing it. But we're doing it the quick and dirty way today. There we go. So now that we have recorded a sample, we can actually throw it into Zyklöps. Just drag and drop. We get the choice between two different synthesis engines, the older and the newer one. Both have their own characteristics. Would highly recommend you checking the manual and playing around and seeing what works best for your specific sample. We're going to use Resynthesis 2. It will take a second to load, and now this sample is transformed into this new oscillator. And now we can move between the 4 waveforms it created to regenerate this sound, which is quite an interesting little trick. Now, of course, the big question is, does it sound anything like the sound we put into it? Not entirely, but we can work on that, of course. Better. There we go. So as you can see, it's not a exact one-to-one clone, which is of course kind of obvious because you have all these extra parameters to play around with. Actually, if I zero everything out, it's fairly close. So from this point on, you can start to manipulate the sound you just input to create some more interesting effects. And just to make it a little bit easier on myself, I will just a little MIDI sequence in here. Because we're lazy, we're just going to do this. Which gives us a good reason to activate the arpeggiator as well. And let's not pre-roll that. Let's just start here, please. Thank you. And let's just loop that. As you can see, you can quite quickly take that bell sound and mess around with it. Now there's also a chance that you actually don't want this to be a bell sound anymore, in which case you're in luck, because you can actually just take the modulation of the position, and now you can actually The neat thing here is you can resynthesize whatever you want. So I have some random samples here, so I'm just going to drag something in and hope it's not all that embarrassing. Let's see what happens. Apparently I randomly picked a bell sound. Quite impressive. Let's toss in a different waveform. There we go. Now the more complex the waveform, the smaller the chance it will actually sound anything like what you put in, but that's just how it works. So here we have a random kind of drum loop thing apparently. Aside from creating it as a loop, you can of course just throw out the time modulator and just change everything around to be more of a oscillator. And then you can double it up with maybe a more traditional oscillator. As you can see, you can take that drum loop and just create it into much more of a traditional synth, but still keep some interesting character going on in there, because you still get all that sound in there. And if this is a little bit static for your taste, you can of course just mess around with it. For instance, one thing I like to do is take one of the LFOs and basically turn it into a note random. So now every time you press a note, it will change this amount. And if you assign this to that waveform, it will per note change where the waveform is picked, which is pretty interesting. The only downside of this waveform, of course, is that there's quite a few gaps in there, so it does tend to be quite often that you miss the volume, but in a lot of samples it does work. Maybe if we just move a little bit over to more here. You can create some really weird, spooky, dissonant sounds if you want to. And that's where you get a lot of the power from this synth engine, is playing around and not relying too much on predicting what's going to happen, but just feeling free to randomly take some of these parameters and just messing around with them a bit and just seeing where things go, which is really a spirit. Also for Myth, the spirit of this kind of synthesis is it's not exactly predictable. It's not like a sampler where you load in a sample and you will get back exactly what you put in. Here it's more of a, you import a vibe and you see wherever it goes, and I quite like that concept, especially with the controls being this easy to use. It's just fun to mess around with and see what happens. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work, and it's all totally fine, really. And that's really the spirit, I think, with both Myth and Zyklop. And I think Dawesome did a good job capturing that feeling of just exploring and seeing what happens, and what happens. And yeah, and again, just to reiterate, the fact that this is completely free, you can just download it right now, and I would highly recommend you do, is pretty insane. There's not that many synth engines out there that try to do different things. There's a lot of the same-ish thing, right? The wavetables, the samplers, the additive, the subtractive synthesizers. There's not that many synth engines that kind of do different things, and this together with I think it's called Pendulum, the free version of Generate, are outliers in that field. And again, that being given away for free is a little bit ludicrous. But hey, more power to us, I guess. So that's Zyklop in a nutshell. If you want to see more about this synth engine, I would recommend checking out my videos on Myth. Again, there's a whole lot of overlap there, and a lot of the stuff that applies to Myth applies to Zyklop as well. So really cool outing by Dawesome, for sure. And they didn't even pay me to say that, because they don't have to, because it's a free plugin. So if you want to see it for yourself, download it. Again, no registration needed, nothing needed. Just download it, play around with it, and whatever you do, just have fun with it. All right, that's it for this one, and I will see you in the next one. The downside of no scripting videos is that it's easy to forget things, so I didn't show the exact differences between Zyklop and Myth, which is kind of important for a buying decision. So with Zyklop, you get all these fixed modulators, In MIF you can actually add as many modulators as you want. So if you want more LFOs, you can just add more LFOs or ASRs. And there's also MAF, which isn't available here, and a bunch of extra MIDI bindings. So that's pretty cool. You got, of course, the 2 irises with a fade, but also with a ring mod option. So you can ring modulate between the two. And because you have 2 irises, you can actually import stereo samples to have these running in a stereo configuration. So that's a big important thing. Another thing to note is the oscillators. 2 oscillators on MIF, a single oscillator on ZYKLØP. And much like the effects, you have more options available in MIF. Here you have 3 slots, here you have 6 slots, and you have more options. The filter section as well, 3 versus 6, and again, slightly different selection of effects available, and effects, like I said, 3 versus 6, again, with a slightly different setup. And you have some more advanced effects options, like for instance the routing, so you can output things halfway through the chain, which is pretty cool. For your general controls, one of the big changes is the freeze. In MIF you can actually freeze parameters, so when you start randomizing things, those parameters stay the same. This is a functionality that's lost in ZYKLØP, so that's something to keep in mind. And the collection of presets is of course different between the 2 synthesizers. You also have a 12 versus 24 polyphony limit. And those are the biggest changes between the 2 products. Now, I would say if you really enjoy ZYKLØP, but you keep running into limitations, for instance on the oscillator filter or effects, or you just want to get a little bit more experimental, it's definitely interesting to look into MIF. There's a good chance you can already do a lot of the things you want to do with ZYKLØP, so I would always recommend try ZYKLØP first, and then if you're still feeling like you're missing out on things, you can go to MIF to see if that scratches your itch.